Hey everyone, this is Cathy Murrow with our TreASures and welcome to Coffee with Cathy. Today's discussion topic is sensory integration, which is also known as sensory processing. And that is essentially the neurological process in which our brains receive information or stimuli through the environment or our bodies. And then it takes that information and organizes it, interprets it, and then determines whether or not it needs to create a response through our nervous system. So sensory integration is a very important part of our lives because it not only helps us to understand and experience our current environment, but also the world around us. Sensory integration also is important for helping us understand what is happening to and within our bodies. So it's very much an important part of how we move, how we feel, and how we act. Now, there are a lot of individuals, including autistic individuals, who have sensory processing differences, and some also refer to this as sensory processing disorder. And that is when the brain has a difficult time processing and responding to the information or stimuli it is receiving through the senses. And that can make it difficult for someone to understand their environment or what's happening to their bodies. So I like for us to take a deeper dive into our sensory systems, and I will do that in presentation mode to help guide your discussion if you're not able to join me in person. Okay, so how can sensory dysregulation impact our lives and how we ultimately behave? Well, it can happen in two ways. First, when we receive sensory input through one of our senses, our brain can be hypersensitive to it, which can create an over-response, which can lead to sensory avoidant behaviors, or it can be hyposensitive, which can create an under-response, which may lead to sensory seeking behaviors. So let's use our auditory sensory system or our sense of hearing as an example. So when our brain receives information through our ears and has a hypersensitivity to it, we may hear things much louder than others can, or may even pick up on sounds that other people don't. And so that can lead to sensory avoidant behaviors like covering your ears or needing headphones in order to go to places. It can also mean avoiding going to places where there may be loud sudden noises like a bowling alley or movie theater. It can also mean that your brain may have difficulty filtering through all the different sounds that may be coming to you at the same time. For example, if you are having a conversation with someone in a crowded room, your brain may have difficulty isolating the voice of the person speaking to you, and you are receiving all of the voices happening in the room all at once with the same amount of importance. And so that can lead to just an auditory sensory overload and understandably a lot of stress. On the flip side of that, the brain can be hyposensitive, and so that hyposensitivity can lead to an under-response. So a person may need to increase the volume when they're hearing something, or they may speak louder than what is considered normal. And they may have sensory seeking behaviors such as creating sounds that may be self-soothing to them. So tapping, clicking, repetitive clapping, or they may vocalize, so a lot of humming or just different vocalizations, or they may also need maybe headphones with loud music or just background noise to help them focus. So that is the general premise of just hypersensitivity or hyposensitivity to the sensory system. And so we can use that concept with all of the sensory systems. So the next question is, how many sensory systems are impacted by this? Because our bodies have many different sensory systems. Well, when we think of our senses, we think of 5. We think of our tactile sensory system, which is our sense of touch, the olfactory system, which is our sense of smell, the gustatory system, which is our sense of taste, the auditory system, which is our sense of hearing, and the visual system, which is our sense of sight. And all of those are impacted with sensory processing differences. But we actually have 8 sensory systems that we see impacted with autism, ADHD, and other individuals who have sensory processing differences. So we are pretty familiar with the first 5, but I'd like to take a deeper dive into the other 3 for those who may not be familiar with them. So the first system is the vestibular sensory system, and that system regulates our sense of balance and spatial orientation. Now the vestibular sensory system is located in our inner ear, and so that is what controls our equilibrium. So for those individuals who've had dizzy spells or felt off balance or have dealt with vertigo, then you've dealt with a vestibular system that's been out of whack. So how does that impact other people who may have sensory processing differences? Well, those who may be hypersensitive to vestibular input may feel off balance a lot easier. They may have motion sickness or may get car sick very easily. And so that's the picture that you see there. And hyposensitivity is the opposite clearly, where I think of the stereotypical behavior that we see sometimes of a child that is constantly spinning round and round and round and doesn't get dizzy. So that is a sensory seeking behavior for someone who has a hyposensitive response through their vestibular system. The next system is the proprioceptive sensory system, and that tells us what our body is doing and where it is in space. And so our muscles and our joints are full of receptors. And so an example of this is I can close my eyes and put my arms out, and even though I can't see where my hands are, I know where they are, and I can feel where they're going where I move them, so I can bring my finger to my nose because I can feel where it is in space. It's also how I can climb a ladder and climb up steps without having to look at my feet to see how high I'm actually raising my foot. And the proprioceptive system also detects and controls force and pressure. So that's pushing and pulling. When you're pushing and pulling, you can tell how much force or how hard you are pushing or pulling. So when someone has a hypersensitivity to that, they may have a difficult time with climbing, or may just feel very uncomfortable with that. And when I think of it, I'll do this in an educational level. So this is what we see in schools. A person who is hypersensitive to the proprioceptive sense may write very soft, where someone who is hyposensitive may write very hard and like press really hard on their pencil. Hyposensitive individuals may like very loose clothing, where hyposensitivity may like very tight clothing and like deep pressure and squeezes. A child who is hypersensitive maybe want to be at the back of the line because they don't want to be accidentally bumped into, where the person who is hyposensitive may actually be doing the bumping or may like rough play. So as you can see in the picture, you have the hypersensitive person who is avoiding like the climbing equipment and may also avoid like bike riding and things like that, where the hyposensitive child in that picture is actually using the car to push it versus just riding in it and likes the force of pushing. And the interoceptive sensory system tells us what our body is feeling. The proprioceptive system tells us what our body's doing. Interoceptive tells us what we are feeling inside. So these receptors or these senses are attached to our organs. And so it tells us things like whether or not we're hungry, whether we're thirsty, whether we're full, whether or not we need to use the bathroom. It senses the butterflies in our stomach, so very much is an important part of how we feel in our emotions. And it tells us whether or not our heart is racing. So someone who is hypersensitive to the interoceptive sense may be very emotionally sensitive. They may be people who have who may go to the restroom often because they're trying to avoid the sense of having a full bladder. Whereas the hyposensitive person may have more accidents because they don't necessarily feel a full bladder, or they may have feelings but may not be able to interpret what it is that they're feeling inside. And also the sensory seeking person also may have more dangerous behaviors or inappropriate behaviors because they don't have a sense of fear. They don't feel all the butterflies and the things that make us apprehensive and may make us hesitant to do certain things. So as we continue to talk about the sensory systems, these are some discussion questions that maybe you can take to your group that kind of help guide your discussion. First, take this opportunity to just share your experiences and your knowledge with either your child, yourself, or someone you know who may have sensory processing differences. What senses are being impacted and how? Also, do you notice whether or not they are sensory seeking or sensory avoidant? And what specific behaviors do you notice that demonstrate that? And then also, what strategies and interventions do you have in place that you guys can share with one another that could help provide appropriate sensory input or to help avoid sensory overload? And lastly, I think it would be great either during the discussion or on your own after the discussion to take the time to identify all the senses and what you dislike the most. For example, with your sense of taste, what things can you not stand to eat? Or what sound just sounds like scratching a chalkboard? Or what smells can you not stand? Think about those dislikes and then also consider what it would feel like to have that exposure constantly and how that may impact your life or your behaviors. And hopefully that'll help you gain some perspective on what others may be experiencing who have sensory processing differences. So thank you for watching this video, and my hope is that during your conversation you're able to not only learn more about sensory systems but also about how sensory dysregulation can impact someone's life. My hope is that you're also able to learn some strategies that may help prevent or minimize either sensory overwhelm that could potentially lead to meltdowns or sensory under-responsiveness that could potentially lead to inappropriate or dangerous behaviors. But if you need more help with how to deal with sensory integration issues, please contact your local occupational therapist who specializes in sensory integration therapy and also emotional regulation. So thanks again for watching, and I'll see you next time.